Hello, AP Environmental, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Environmental Systems. So, this will be a very quick story, so gather around the pond, my little tadpoles, as we venture into environmental systems. So why do environmental scientists care anyway, and why do they study a whole system rather than just focusing on like individual plants and animals or substances within that system? So imagine taking apart your cell phone and trying to understand how it works simply by focusing in like on the microphone. You wouldn't get very far. Just like that, it's important for environmental scientists to look at the whole picture, the whole pattern, the chemistry pieces, the physics pieces, to really understand how an entire system works. With the working knowledge of how a system functions, we can predict how change will happen at any part of the system. Like the Mono Lake example, we could have predicted those water level changes throughout the entire system. So studying systems allows scientists to think about how natural things and energy flow in an environment and how it can happen. And in this way, researchers can learn about complex relationships like between organisms and their actual environment and like what specifically is going on. So in this next little section here, we're going to explore what we call system dynamics, and that is the changes in this system across a space and definitely over time. And in each case, we'll focus on something, how energy and matter flow in that specific environment. So in system dynamics, as we suggested at the very beginning of this whole discussion, the Mono Lake ecosystem changed over time. In some years, there were more algae growing in the lake that fed more brine shrimp, and in some years, there were fewer gulls, which stopped all the overfeeding, removing less of the shrimp, removing less matter, and therefore less energy out of the system. So these changing parameters describe the system dynamics of Mono Lake. And there are a number of terms that we can use to describe a system. Like we can say that it's opened or closed. Systems can be either open in one sense and closed in another. An open system exchanges matter and energy across all boundaries. And a closed system, matter and energy exchange, they do not occur through system boundaries. Closed systems are less common than open systems. We sometimes call those like underground systems. I can think of a cave, for example, which is almost a completely closed system, right? And then also these systems have inputs and outputs. And both of these have numerical values attached to that. But by now you've seen lots of things with numerical values. Inputs, which are additions into the system, and outputs, which are not necessarily taken, but they're usually losses from the system. And people who study these inputs and outputs are often called system analysis, and they can determine inputs and outputs and exchanges in a system under a variety of conditions. So these researchers who studied Mono Lake might qualify as a system analysis because there's a lot of factors going in and out of here, like just the salt, for example, as an input or as an output. And, it's a terminal lake. But does it mean it's a terminal lake? All systems, no matter how big they are, small or large, can be analyzed through system dynamics. Before we get to this huge example of Earth, let's just think of a system like a cow, for example. A cow has an input and output. We input water into a cow, grass into a cow, sunlight into the cow, oxygen into the cow, and the output of the cow, it definitely expels waste, it expels water, it expels heat, it expels carbon dioxide. So essentially, a cow can also be referred to as a system, just like this Earth here. Earth is an open system with respect to energy, and solar radiation enters Earth, and then energy leaves Earth in the form of heat or reflected light. And Earth is essentially a closed system with respect to matter, because very little matter enters or leaves Earth. And the white arrows indicate this cycling of matter and energy, and it really depends upon what we're talking about here, whether we describe Earth as an open or a closed system. In system dynamics, we can refer to a system as in a steady state. So here we have this leaky bucket. This leaky bucket has an input of 1 liter per minute, it looks like, based on this diagram. And as a result, there's no change in the total amount of water in the bucket because it also has an output of 1 liter per minute. And so the system is considered a steady state. Besides our bucket here, most natural systems are in a steady state. And why is that? A natural system can respond to change of its inputs and its outputs. So for example, during a period of drought, the evaporation at the lake would be greater than the combined precipitation and the stream water that was flowing into Mono Lake. So therefore, the lake will begin to dry up. But soon there will be less surface water available for evaporation. So then the evaporation rate will continue to fall until it matches its new lower precipitation rate. And when this happens, then the system will return to technically a steady state and the lake will stop shrinking. So, of course, the opposite is also true. In a very wet periods, the lake size will grow and evaporation from the expanded surface area of the lake will continue to increase until the system returns to a steady state at which the inputs and the outputs again are equal. So these adjustments in inputs and output rates caused by changes to a system are what we call feedbacks. The result of a process feedback into a system to change the rate of this process. Feedbacks can be described more like a loop or a cycle and are found throughout just environmental systems in general. Feedback can be either also negative or positive. So in natural systems, scientists most often observe what we call negative feedback loops. And in a system responding to a change by returning to its original state or by decreasing the rate at which the change is occurring. Now, basically the surface area for the Mono Lake example. Positive feedbacks occur in the natural world too, but it's also shown an example of like how birth weights in a population give rise to a positive feedback loop. So the more members of a species that can reproduce, then the more births there will be, creating this positive feedback, more people to have babies, and then the babies grow up and more babies to have more babies. So it's like a positive feedback. And it's important to note that positive and negative feedbacks here, it's not good or bad. Instead, it's more of like an example of how we're trying to describe these changes and how we're trying to describe the dynamics of a system. So on a negative and positive feedback loop. All right, a negative feedback loop occurred at Mono Lake when the water level, the lake level dropped, and then that reduced the surface area, which was less evaporation. And so with less evaporation, then it's not losing as much water, and then it'll rain eventually, the water's levels will rise, and And same with the population, all right? If I have more babies, then my population is going to increase, and with an increased population, I have more babies, and then those more babies have more babies. So it's like creating a cycle that increases the population size. And so this is how we describe in terms negative feedback loop and positive feedback loop.